If you're a Xennial, you've probably noticed how easily you can move between two different worlds, and how exhausting that can feel even when you're doing it well. You can talk to someone older and understand their instincts without forcing it. You can talk to someone younger and understand their language without mocking it. And somehow, you still end up feeling like you don't fully belong to either side. Not because you're lost, but because your brain learned to live in transition. That's what bridge generation really points to. It's not just about years. It's about growing up with one set of psychological expectations and then being asked to function inside a completely different set before you were finished becoming yourself. You learned privacy as the default and then had to learn visibility as normal. You learned boredom as a regular part of life and then watched stimulation become constant. You learned patience through waiting and then watched speed become the standard. Research shows that the brain builds its sense of safety from patterns that repeat. When your early environment required you to figure things out, wait for answers, and tolerate uncertainty, those skills didn't just become habits, they became a baseline. Studies suggest that when that baseline is later replaced by high-speed information, constant alerts, and ongoing social comparison, your nervous system doesn't simply update. It often runs both systems at once. Part of you still expects quiet. Another part of you stays ready to respond. That's why Xennials often feel calm on the outside and busy on the inside. You can appear low drama and grounded, but there's usually a subtle mental scanning happening underneath. You know how to read the room. You know how to adapt your tone. You know how to be competent in multiple settings. And none of that is accidental. Psychological studies indicate that people who grow up in shifting environments often develop strong cognitive flexibility, meaning they can switch perspectives quickly. But that same flexibility can come with higher cognitive load, where your mind spends extra energy just switching modes, even when nothing looks stressful. This shows up in your relationship with attention. You remember what it felt like to be alone with your thoughts, not as a wellness practice, but as something that happened naturally. You could stare out a window, replay a conversation, imagine a future, and there was space for it. Then the environment changed. Now attention is constantly pulled outward. Recent research suggests that frequent interruptions make it harder for the brain to return to deeper focus, even if you're disciplined. So you might find yourself craving quiet, not because you're fragile, but because your system recognizes how rare it has become. It also shows up in how you relate to identity. The older social world taught a slower kind of self-definition. You were someone, and over time, people learned you. The newer social world asks for faster signals. Who you are becomes something you present. Xennials often learned both languages. You can be authentic and still feel aware of how you're perceived. You can be private and still understand the pressure to share. Researchers have found that when people live in environments where feedback is constant, the brain becomes more sensitive to evaluation. Not always anxious, just alert. And if you grew up when invisibility felt safer, you may still feel, deep down, that being seen comes with a cost. That nervous system logic can carry into relationships. Many Xennials are emotionally intelligent, but not always emotionally performative. You may care deeply while preferring low-maintenance connection. You might want closeness, but feel drained by constant contact. Studies suggest that attachment and emotional regulation aren't only shaped by big events, but by the everyday rhythm of connection and recovery. If you grew up with more independence and fewer constant check-ins, your system may feel safest when closeness has breathing room. Not distant, just spacious. Another Xennial pattern is competence as identity. You learned in an era where problem-solving often required effort, and effort created a sense of earned stability. So even now, you might carry a quiet belief that you should be able to handle things. When stress hits, you don't always panic. You organize, you plan, you push through. Research shows that self-reliance can be adaptive, but it can also become a default coping style where asking for support feels strangely uncomfortable, even when support is available. That's why some Xennials can look strong and steady while feeling privately overextended. And then there's the modern layer, comparison. You don't have to be insecure to feel the effects of constant exposure to other people's lives. Sometimes it's not envy, it's just information. You see how other people live, parent, date, work, relax, and your brain logs it as reference points. Psychological studies indicate that social comparison becomes more frequent when comparison cues are more available. For Xennials, this can create a strange split. You remember a time when your self-image was mostly built in private, and you now live in a time where self-image is constantly reflected back through feeds, trends, and cultural expectations. The internal cost of being a bridge generation isn't always dramatic. It's subtle. It can feel like decision fatigue because there are too many options for everything now. It can feel like mental clutter, where your mind is always partly open, always partly reachable. It can feel like a low-grade pressure to stay current, even if you don't care about being trendy. And it can feel like a quiet grief for simplicity, without wanting to romanticize the past. But the bridge identity also comes with a kind of psychological range. You can remember what life felt like before constant stimulation, which means you can recognize the difference between noise and meaning. You can adapt to modern systems without fully merging your inner life into them. You can understand different value systems without needing to turn one of them into a personality. Researchers have found that people who live through major cultural shifts often develop a stronger tolerance for ambiguity because uncertainty became familiar. That's not nothing. That's a form of resilience that doesn't always get labeled as resilience. So if you felt in between, it doesn't necessarily mean you're behind. It can mean you've been translating between worlds for most of your life. And translation takes energy, even when you're fluent. Maybe the most accurate way to describe Xennials isn't that you're stuck between generations. It's that you learned how to carry two realities at once, quietly, without needing applause for it. If this felt familiar, you can like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who's always felt like the bridge.